welcome everyone to our seminar series at the Price Center for Social Innovation. We'll go ahead and get started so that we can maximize our time with Maria Ballesteros-Sola, who is an assistant professor at the School of Business and Economics, Channel Islands, Cal State University, Channel Islands here in California. I think everybody who's with us saw the invitation, so I don't want to spend too much time doing an introduction. I'll let Maria also kind of introduce herself and share. But I know I'm really excited about learning more about B Corp certification. Just as by way of background and context, and this might be interesting for those of you who joined us, we had a really interesting seminar about 3 years ago, which we called Delicious Social Innovation. And what we had is 3 different food social enterprises, all who had kind of entered the space with different kinds of organizational forms. One pure nonprofit, faith-based. One was for-profit, maybe certified B Corp at this point, don't know. And then the other was kind of another form. And so I think these sorts of models are really exciting to learn about. So with that, Maria, I'd love to turn it over to you. For the audience, if you have questions as you go, please drop them in the chat. We'll make sure to, I'll make sure to moderate the chat. If there's a question that's really pressing, I'll interrupt Maria, but otherwise we'll save a lot of those questions to until the end. So Maria, thank you so much for joining us today.
Excellent. Thank you, Gary, Christine, and the whole team for the invitation and everyone that is joining us today. I know how Zoom out we are all at, so it's always rewarding to see that we actually have a lot of people interested in the topic. I was trying to figure out what could be of interest for your audience, and of course we have, a little bit of a diverse audience. We have researchers, we might have some practitioners. So I wanted to be sure I'm addressing all the different needs, and I divided in 3 big blocks. So I would like to give a little bit of background about the certification for those of you that are less familiar. In my view, the certification is moving into this idea of a global movement, and I want to talk on that. And then it's a question, right? I don't have the answer. I have some hypotheses, but it's really B Corp, a social innovation sandbox. And finally, as the third big block, I would like to introduce you to B Academics. It's a network of academics that now for 5 years have been researching and teaching and engaging with the B Corp community. And I want to be sure that I share my call for engagement because very exciting things are happening. I don't like to talk a lot about my background, but I want to explain how did I get here and how did I get into this field. I do come from a background in the industry. I was not an academic right out of the bat. I went to law school. I studied with the Jesuits. I got my MBA and I did management consultant. And eventually moving to California allowed me on my 40s to figure out what I wanted to do with the rest of my life and became an academic, right? And I got my PhD in 2017. And again, I basically have a corporate career. And then what happened during my corporate career, I'm trained by the Jesuits. I went to law school with the Jesuits. I also was doing a lot of social service through nonprofits, right? And I volunteer nonprofit all my life. And I also started here in California, Startup Kids, and we're teaching entrepreneurship to 3rd grade to 8th grade. So I always have, a passion for service. But basically what was going on is that for me, service and my corporate career were 2 separate worlds. And that's what I'm using, that 2-hat figure. And I like to say it was Maria a day working for a corporation and Maria at night, right? Which sounds terrible, but that was the reality. And then in 2010, we have Professor Yunus coming to campus. We have the California Institute for Social Business. And in very simple words, because if you have heard, Professor Yunus talking, he explained that you can actually use business as a force for good. And for me, that was like, wow, putting these 2 hats, but right, those 2 Marias that have a struggle or have just coexist for many years, put them together and say, yes, business can be a force for good and social change. And that's what prompted me to start getting into, again, hybrid. We'll talk a little bit later, hybrid organizations and understanding how that, is possible. So as researchers, sometimes we don't, or I used to go so fast, zoom, research, to collect data, you analyze it, but what is our why, and why the B Corp movement also started to interest me is as an educator, right? Because it really resonates with our students. If you say hybrid organizations, they are like, what is she talking about? But if you explain, what is a B Corp and what are some of those, the poster child of the B Corp movement, in our case is Patagonia, and it's in our backyard. So all my students know what Patagonia is, because many are from Ventura and Camarillo area. As a researcher, as we will discuss later, is because finally, I can put limits and boundaries to the phenomena I'm trying to understand. Again, that's in contrast with the whole social entrepreneurship definition. Well, we don't have to spend 15 years trying to figure out what a B Corp is. Either you are a B Corp or you are not. And then because I also do work with the local community in terms of, well, I will explain a little bit later, the B Corp impact clinics. And these are a group of students that do serve as consultant for companies that want to explore the certification. So it's also an experiential model that it got started, by Jessica, our president of the academics, and in NC State in North Carolina, and it's kind of spreading. And the model is very defined and very, again, attractive for the students, because they have an opportunity to work hand to hand with an entrepreneur to help them figure out if the certification is for them. So let me start with that first big blog. After that, brief introduction about the B Corp background. And if you guys are familiar with many of the eco labels that have been, popping up in the last 20 years, Rainforest Alliance, the Leaping Bunny for cruelty product, USDA organic, of course, Energy Star, fair trade certified, we have been, again, as consumers, as a researcher, analyzing those. The brilliance of the B Corp certification is actually realizing that a part of the product, you could try to come out with the idea of an eco label for the whole company. So it's a holistic certification. I get this question a lot, like, how is a B Corp certification different from other eco label or sustainable label? Well, again, my pen maybe is fair trade, and that's not a good example, but let's say I'm having coffee, I get rid of my coffee, it's fair trade, but other than the guarantee that the farmers are paying some sort of sustainable living, I don't know what's behind the company, right? So what, again, I like to say is that it's a holistic certification of the whole company. I also shared a little bit about the story because I think, again, the founders of B Lab are brilliant. They are business people, and I think it's important to put that on the table and understand where they were coming from. Two of them, Jacob Gilbert and Bart Houlihan, were the founders of a basketball gear company called N1, and they were doing very well. It's not like they were just using recycled materials, but they started to do a lot of work to figure out who the suppliers were, and a lot of work in terms of benefits for the employees. But as they were facing this huge growth, they like to say they were like second after Nike, they started to welcome capital from other sources, right? And they got venture capital money. Again, revenues were exploding, but by 2005, they realized that as they were welcoming this money, the principles of the value that they had been trying to establish in the company were being compromised because this investor didn't agree with some of the expenses that they were having. So basically, they sold the company. They called a friend, right? That's the third founder of B Lab, Andrew Kasoy, which have a background in real estate investment. And they tried to figure out like what's next, right? We have a little bit of money to think through. And they look for different options. They explore the possibility of starting another responsible company. But again, this is where the genius of these people comes. They realize that there was a gap in those sustainable labels, mapping. We have a lot of, as we say, a lot of certifications for product, but there was nothing that tell me that the company is following these socially and environmentally responsible principles. So in 2006, they decided to found a nonprofit. And for me, I'm a lawyer by training. So the fact that they founded a nonprofit is very appealing. And I'll talk a little bit later about that because that's a question I asked to Bart. Like, you guys were business people, why a nonprofit, right? To be the certification authority. So that was 2006 in Philadelphia. The first group of B Corp certified companies came in 2007. So just to make it clear for the beginning, basically as a B Corp is a for-profit. Those are the only type of legal structure that can certify as such. A non-profit, which is another question I get a lot, a non-profit cannot certify. We'll see later that a non-profit can take the impact assessment, but they cannot certify as a B Corp. And again, they are going to be required that demonstrate that are performing through that impact assessment. I will talk a little bit later. Accountability and public transparency, because they are going to be reporting. They will create a benefit report once a year. So right now we're talking about 4,000 certified B Corp in more than 70 countries, 101 industry, and they like to see with one unifying goal that is using business as a force for good. So if you connect this with I mentioned before, that's why this really started to resonate with me when I first discovered them 2010, and then we have an event here in Patagonia in 2013. That's when I get into this spectrum. So let me put some names in front of you. These are very well-known brands, and just get your attention to actually one of the higher education institutions that's called Laureate Education. And I actually published a case. We interview the founder, Doc Becker. Is a very, very interesting case of how a private higher education institution were able to break through the noise that all private institutions were subject to, right? Because they were using this marketing practice, and how the B Corp became a competitive advantage and differentiating factor. I also looked for a few B Corps in Southern California. I know you guys are familiar. Again, as a lawyer, I want to bring your attention to Homeboy's electronic recycle. It's a very interesting case. I did my dissertation, it was one of my cases on Homeboys. And what happened is at some point, they discovered this company called Isidore Recycling that was already working with same population that Homeboys, and Tom Bosso, based on his previous expertise, obviously on acquiring companies, decided like, why not? So here we have a nonprofit that actually owns a B Corp. I think that, again, that's a very interesting circumstances. And I haven't seen other. If anyone has seen something similar, please let me know. But it's the only B Corp that I know that is owned by a 501c3. And then I also want to point out, as we talk later a little bit about the movement, from you obviously have the organizations, the B Corp, but there is this group, and it started very organically, of B Corps in certain areas that became in some cases, they didn't adopt any structure, but became also nonprofit, like Be Local LA. The executive director is Andrea Chase. She's the CSR director for Airborne, and she also is mobilizing the B Corp community in our region. Let me emphasize just, who can become certified. I already expressed that, of course, these are for profit, but any size. And by any size, I mean, you could be a sole proprietorship, just, working for yourself, no employees, all the way to multinational corporations that we're going to see later. Any industry, geography, as you take the assessment, the B impact assessment, you get some screening questions that are going to be asking you to take different impact assessments. There are up to 70 different versions, but it's adjusted to industry, size, and geography. I already mentioned any legal structure, as long as you are obviously on the for-profit side, not tax exempt status. And what they are doing now is, if the companies are over 1 year old, they can certify. If you are still under 12 months, what they are going to give you is this pending B Corp label. Is a little bit different. Yesterday, we have a speaker on campus, virtually from Brazil, and it's an example of a pending B Corp. Wiflo is a Brazilian social entrepreneur, and they are still under that certified pending corporation. So, oops, I went a little bit too fast. Just to be clear in the requirements, I already mentioned you have to take this impact assessment. The expectation is you get at least 80 points. People also ask, why 80 points? And BLAB never give you a clear answer, right? Why did they establish that threshold? And it was based on what the first ones submitted. So that they thought that was reachable, but not too easy. And that kind of stayed through the 6 versions. We are now using version 6 for the impact assessment. They are going to ask you, again, that you publish your reporting, that you also publish your annual benefit report publicly. There is a legal requirement. And that's the second, when I think of the founders of BLAB, the second genius spark that they have. They realized that a certification alone wasn't going to actually create system change. But if they were able to convince our politicians that there was a need for a different legal structure, in that way, we might start seeing more systemic change. But they actually lobby for a new legal statute called the Benefit Corporation that now is in 35 states, and that include Delaware. So as part of the requirement to get certified, assuming you get the 80 points and you commit to transparency, depending on what original legal structure you have, they are going to require to adjust your article of the incorporation and your governing documents to become a B Corp, a benefit corporation. And of course, they're a nonprofit, but they have a good earned income strategy. They are going to ask you to pay an annual fee. And that the minimum is $1,000 for companies that have annual revenues of $150,000. And again, that's a challenge for the small entrepreneurs to have to commit $1,000 for this cost, but as we see, some of them will find it useful. Let me just briefly introduce the 5 dimensions in case you haven't seen those, but they ask questions and they have expectations when it comes to governance, to workers, community, environment, and customers. And I was mentioning the versions. Version 6 did a good job expanding the list of requirements in the context of customers. Up to version 5, the only thing they ask is really if you are working for customers that are in populations at risk, but in customer stewardship, they are introducing a lot of quality checkpoints, how you communicate with the customers. So I think as we move forward, we're in the second year of D6. That's been very helpful to bring the consumer on board. In case you're curious, because they obviously try to understand as we change the version, it looks like the versions are getting a little bit harder. So we are seeing that the average B Corp score is going down as they increase the version. So when they have version 3, the average was 98. And now what we are seeing is that the average is down to 90 points. Let me show you before, we briefly talk about BLAB, just this table I created as part of one chapter. It's just to understand the difference between, again, the B Corp certification and the benefit corporation statute. Because not all big corporations, if you are an LLC, you don't have to become a benefit corporation. And if you decided to be a benefit corporation, you don't have to certify necessary with BLAB. You can use any other party standard. But if you use a lot of common sense, it will make sense that if you become a benefit corporation, you end up also using BLAB. And again, that's what I appeal to the genius of the founders that saw the gap in the eco-label landscape, but then they were also, or they understood that without legal change, that systemic change that they are trying to achieve wasn't going to occur. And being selfish too, for my cause, right, I'm always like the black sheep on my campus because I'm the only one that is teaching and researching in this arena. But up to a couple of years ago, they were kind of questioned, what is this? B Corp is a marginal thing. And the more they hear other people, other colleagues, that now there is, again, multinationals that are adopting the certification and that there is a legal structure, I think it brings a lot of credibility to the movement, which it could be just a certification. Let me just add a final reflection before we go into the B Corp expansion on the B Lab. I mentioned that I asked Bart, why you guys went for a nonprofit certification, and there were a couple of reasons why. The first one is credibility. If these three businessmen at the end will have created a certification authority that was actually a for-profit, I think a lot of people will have questioned their motives, right? But being a nonprofit, that gives them the credibility that they are not just here for the money, because of obviously the non-distribution constraint of a nonprofit. But there was a second reason, and was basically the funding. I mean, they knew that to be able to just be funded on the earned income that they were getting for the certification wasn't going to be enough. So they needed to rely on grants and donations. However, they do have, a good goal, I think, of trying to reduce the amount that they need to fundraise, and their goal is to really get into that. If you look at 2019, 68% of that 12 million annual budget is already coming from the certification fees, which is fantastic. And again, the goal they always talk about is this 80% of self-sustaining and obviously having donations. They have big names, between 5 and 10 millions. When you look at the list of donors, they had the Ford Foundation, Prudential Financial, Rockefeller Foundation. So they're still collecting, a good amount from good sources. Is there any questions up to here? Questions? And Gary, I didn't know. Congratulations for, creating those graduates.
Oh, yes,
it's amazing.
Yes, we were very excited to work with her. So we followed her career there at Isidore for quite a while, and including the decision to be acquired by a nonprofit, which was an interesting set of choices there. Part of that was the challenges she faced in terms of managing the dual structure of the B Corp and a nonprofit to take donations and such, and that it actually worked better for her. One reason was to be part of a larger network, which was Homeboy.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, we'll talk of the records, because I want to write a case on that, and I have obviously Tom on board from that side. It will be fantastic to get the other perspective of the company being acquired. No questions? I'll keep moving. Again, that's another add-on of why this get me excited. Is something that is started again in Philadelphia, here in the US, has expanded globally, and now they started actually in South America, Maria Emilia, and Puerto Rico, in Chile. They created Sistema B from almost not the beginning, but 2011. And they had been really one of the drivers of the expansion in South America of the certification. B Lab UK 2013, Australia, New Zealand followed also in 13, B Lab Euro, Taiwan in 16, B Lab East Africa, and Hong Kong, Macau in 2020. And they are, most of them are in building phase, except the US. So it's very interesting to see how eventually they break down organizationally. And now we have US and Canada as a separate entity. And I will not use the word the luxury, because they're working really hard with little resources, but they are really thinking a lot through the theory of change versus the other B Labs, the regional B Lab, that they are in a building phase. And they also have this, I didn't put it on the slide, this idea of the market builders that they call. Those are for some drivers in different geographical areas that are not ready to obviously incorporate as a foundation, like Korea, Malaysia, Japan, China, but they are also pushing the movement and the certification in those other countries. In terms of the geographical expansion, but institutional expansion, what things we are seeing that are happening in the last 1 to 2 years? We see more interest from investors, private equity firms, and VCs. And this number actually comes from B Lab. So assuming it's true, they're talking about 2 billion they manually counted had been invested in B Corps. We are also seeing, obviously, a big drive now by multinationals. If you think of that's one of the poster child, right? Ben and Jerry acquisition by Unilever was something that prompted Unilever and the CEO Paul Polman back then to figure out how he could actually have more of those subsidiaries adopting the certification. Or Happy Family that was bought out by Danone, and Danone, which already was doing a lot of good work with actually Yunus and social businesses, started to also become an advocate for the certification, and many subsidiaries are now also certified. And then there is something, this is 2020, B Lab created these B movement builders to also create groups. It's a small group of multinational corporations that are working very closely to figure out how they can also adopt the certification. I mean, the challenge, obviously, you go back to the impact assessment and the 5 dimensions, and you want to work that into a multinational corporation, there are many, many challenges. The public markets are also reacting well, thanks to the braveness of some of these B Corps that decided that it was worthy to give it a try, and they were well received. So Laureate, the higher education institution that I mentioned, was actually the first benefit corporation IPO. They went public in 2017, and only the third corporation. We have this Rally Software in 13 and Nexi, which is, sadly they couldn't keep the certification because they didn't, they were not able to convince the investors that they needed to change the legal structure. Lemonade is another IPO in 2020, Vital Farm, Nature, this in Brazil, that actually acquired Body Shop and Avon. And as already mentioned, Danone, which is publicly traded, already had 20 subsidiaries, which represent 1/3 of the total sales. A final comment on another initiative that B Lab launched last year is the SDG Action Manager. Of course, the impact assessment is used by companies interested on the certification, although some other companies may take it just as a roadmap, even if they decide not certified. So there are around 100,000 companies that have taken the impact assessment, but they also want to be sure that companies were able to have a tool that allowed them to figure out how they were achieving those goals, those SDGs objectives. So there is some overlap between the questions that you get usually on the SDG Action Manager and the impact assessment, but it is not the same tool. It's a separate tool. Any questions? You guys are quiet and keep an eye on the chat. Okay. Yes, of course. Thank you, Stacy. This is what I wanna put it as a question mark, right? Because I think I'm coming from a place where I'm very, very biased. So I'm borrowing Sandbox actually from Joel. Joel is also in the academic, Gemma Grimes and Kao. They are the first one that put this idea of B Corps as a sandbox for sustainable researchers, social innovation researchers. And as a researcher, I see some clear advantage. I already point out to one is, again, finally, we can put boundaries to the phenomena. Either you are a B Corp certified or you're not. So let's not discuss. I always think about these 10, 15 years that maybe the field, wasted. There's no time wasted if you are, thinking, but it's this idea of what is the definition of social entrepreneur, right? If you're coming from a nonprofit side or the for-profit side. So we don't have to, spend time in getting an operational definition or working definition. We're also, because it's now worldwide, we have data across industry, geography. We also have it at different levels because you can create these clusters, again, based on everything like site, industry, and that make it, I think, very, very interesting for us. And then I'll discuss now the growth of papers or publications we have seen, but there's a lot of questions, right? Every time I meet a B Corp founder or entrepreneur, I have a new question. So the why, the when, the how, where is the return investment of the certification? Like a lot of practitioners are that question. I'm going to spend this money and this effort, how this is going to impact my performance. And of course, because now we have almost since 2007, that's 14 years of data, some companies are not renewing the certification. I didn't say that, but it used to be that you certify for 2 years. And of course, the B Lab expanded that to 3 years because they couldn't really cope with demand. So now you certify for 3 years, but some companies decide not to renew the certification. Why is that, right? And again, thinking of, in my case, I come from a practitioner background, so I want to do some research that matter, right? And I can translate and help the companies to do better. So I think there's a lot of room to create and make an impact. And in the assessment piece, what I want to say is, as much as I love, B Corp, I think it's our responsibility as researchers to tell the truth about how, the certification is impacting performance or consumer perspective. So I think we need to keep that objectivity as we go through the process. So there are a few strengths in if you decide this is an area of interest for you, but there are also a few challenges. The first one is obviously about data collection. I'll talk briefly later about an effort I did with some researchers in Barcelona. We end up creating a database of 180 B Corps, and we did that manually. And that was painful because we will get the company, we will go into B Corporation, the website, and they give you the impact assessment, scoring per dimension. That was very, very painful. But now, this is an important link. The B impact assessment data can be downloaded from this data.world. And this is the name Michelle Bradley, is the B Lab person that can help with this. And she's very responsive. As you download data and you have questions about any of the fields, she will answer you. And they also share the code books through Google Drive. So those are 2 links that I can also share later. There was an early effort through Wharton, and we are still trying to figure out, and I don't have an answer, what that Wharton Research Data Service is going to be made available to the general public, meaning all researchers. And there was an much earlier effort with Duke, and only 30 teams were able to use that data. This is my perception, a little bit subjective, but I've been talking to B Corp for a few years now, and at some point when we send our request to engage, I'm a qualitative researcher, by the way, and they start to say no because they are getting so many requests for that engagement. And then this is, again, it's a challenge because there is this expectation that we are going to be reporting like the beauty and the achievement of B Corps. And I think I don't want to fall in that trap that everything that it comes out of my research, it has to be positive. Christine, I see one question, a little bit about disadvantages, defining the field.
I'm happy to ask it out loud if that would be
useful.
I know it can be hard to read a chat.
Well, yeah.
So you talked about the advantages, sorry, I turned off my video. I was eating my lunch. The advantages of that we have this as a way of creating our samples, but there's also, it seems like a disadvantage that researchers have talked about who chooses to go through the certification process. As you know, some people decide it's not worth it, and they go out. It strikes me that there's some concerns about leaving out all the organizations that decide the certification is not worth it for some reason, if in our definition of firms interested in social value.
Yeah, and by no means I want to sound like this is all we should be doing, because finally we have these boundaries, right? The way I always think about social enterprises, I refer to the alter spectrum, right? And in fact, when we get to my actual research, I've done some work on nonprofit that start social enterprises. So Homeboys is a perfect example. They they have now 9 social enterprises that sadly only bring 35% of the annual income. And then on the other side, you might have, of course, for profit, corporate social responsibility that I think we have overcome. And then as we move more toward the center, we discover this socially responsible business. And B Corp for me is just a subset of those. And I think it's very legit, and it will be interesting to find out why companies that explore the certification decided that it's not for them. But I don't want to exclude those, or I'm not trying to say that and B Corp is creating more impact. In fact, I work, I think it was around 2000, 2012. It was a student in my class, in my social business courses, but he was a sociology major. So he started the company ahead of his time using hemp oil. And at some point through my classes, he learned about the B Corp certification. And out of the first try, he got 152 points. Sorry that I'm bragging, but I'm very, very proud of him. Eventually, 2 years later, he decided to close the company. And it wasn't because the B Corp certification didn't work for him. The company, it was almost like a cult. People with skin issues were, bragging that this was a life changer, but it was a personal decision. In fact, I tried to work on a paper about, the why, but he wasn't happy sharing his reason. But he felt that he was too young to really start just working in one single company, and he decided to leave. And now he's a software engineering. But if I think of is this a failure of a B Corp, or if he has not adopted the certification, was he creating less impact? I would say no. Okay. So again, I'm not trying to be excluded. I just have, again, a very clear picture of, for this type of hybrid organization that I'm interested. I've been working on one side of the spectrum with nonprofit, and I'm all now going to another shallow. For me, it's an example of a shallow hybridity, because there is a dominant logic that is the business one. I'll talk a little bit later about that, but I'm not excluding obviously the impact and the need that we have for other social enterprises. Bob is asking, where's a good way for a small but growing corporation to explore B Corp status? The impact assessment, Bob, is open to everyone. You can start an account now, it's free, and it's going to give you a good sense of where you are as of now, right? It's almost like you are creating a roadmap, and there is no obligation to move with the certification. So that's why you see this big gap. There's 100,000 companies that have taken the impact assessment, and only 4,000 have certified. I personally, I have a nonprofit. When I say I started a nonprofit, my startup kids, I took the impact assessment. So even nonprofit are exploring the impact assessment as a way to understand how they can improve in these 5 dimensions. And of course, you can also reach to universities that are running this B Corp impact clinic if you have a small business, and see if you could be part of their experiential courses on the future. I'm happy to talk more offline of that. I'm looking at the time and it's going too fast. So let me just, where is the time going? Quick Evolution, that is a great, highly recommendable paper. Is actually a commentaries in Discovery about why we care, and they actually did a little bit of tracking of what the literature when it started. The first paper that they found actually come from the legal landscape, because remember we have the benefit corporation beside the certification, so it was coming from scholars and in the legal arena. There was a paper from ethics perspective by Andre in 2012, and then the first one from a business scholar in 2012, that was Connie, and then we see an explosion that is still ongoing by business and management scholars. So I found that very interesting. If you are looking, it's like, okay, I want to start digging in. My advice will be to find, I have the link, this Oxford bibliography, that my colleague, they're both on the board now, Joel and Kay, put together, and this is a great overview what are, again, some of the critical papers and perspective that we are using for the analysis. And I'm sharing here a reference to my chapter. This is general audience. I use it with my students as a good introduction to B Corp, the certification, and some of the literature. Since I will be sharing the slides, I also put here, for those of you interested in dig deeper, there is a great special issue Journal of Business Venturing and a couple of great Academy of Managers discoveries, the commentary I just mentioned, plus some great articles, again, by Joel. I mean, for me, Joel is the person that I follow when it comes to B Corp, and I have the fortune to be working with him in the board and of the academics. Let me show you. I mentioned my research, and as I said, I come from a perspective of hybrid organization, and I'm interested in this idea of shallow hybridity, like nonprofits. Very clear, there is a dominant logic, but some of them start social enterprises. So now, what I'm trying to understand, if I go into that social business, social responsible business part of the spectrum, if we think that B Corp can also be considered a shallow hybridity because there is a dominant logic, in this case that is the business logic. I work on a paper with these colleagues in Barcelona, and I have to say this paper is in a standby because we were trying to understand what were the difference in each of the dimension across 3 regional areas. So this is the sample that we create manually, which was very painful for 60 big corporations in EU, 60 in South America, and 60 in the US. And we spent a little bit of time, and at the end, again, there were no significant differences. And part of what I was trying to figure out, if I go into some of the CSR literature, they kind of bring this idea that the country of origin is going to define part of the decisions companies take on CSR. So I was wondering, well, maybe we can challenge that literature. And I started exploring this idea of the certification as the great equalizer. I mean, can it be now that, I don't know, a company in Taiwan, when it comes to this sustainable practice, almost look the same like a company in Chile, right? So this idea of the great equalizer, I did some case studies with my students, and I was able to talk, in this case in Spain, with a company. They do canned food, and they actually are the suppliers of Patagonia. So if you buy mussels from Patagonia Provisions, you're going to be eating these mussels from a company, a B Corp in Spain. But this is a company that is more than 100-year-old. And then we have what I call the newborn B Corp certifies. And again, how is it that a certification is able to serve the needs of such a distinctive organization, right? 100-year-old and a new entrepreneur. So this is what I'm trying to explore. Again, paper 1 is totally, I don't know if it's dead, but I don't see it moving in the short term. And for this paper too, I'm already collecting data, and I just apply for a grant. So finger crossed that I get some time release from my teaching so I can keep doing data collection. I just want to put out there some future areas of inquiry. Again, improve the understanding of early stage certification. Again, it's such a diverse, that's an advantage, right? Diverse group of companies, but at the same time, we are comparing, big companies or multinational corporations with small entrepreneurs. So how the motivations, the process, or the outcomes are different. I think that this certification is very interesting. I know Kay is doing some work right now on that. What are the industries and regional differences? The role of micro actors. Again, I'm very interested to learn if this is driven by, again, a champion like we saw or I learned through my work on nonprofit. And of course, what is the return on investment and how we can connect the certification with financial performance. And just for those of you that come from more of a nonprofit background, there is this paper, right, that kind of bring this idea that maybe the nonprofit or the third sector is feeling some resistance to the idea of companies taking their place, and specifically the B Corp. So that's another preference. I'm going to very quick. I'm keeping an eye on the chat, but just to be sure, I want to introduce you to B Academics. As I already mentioned, this is a global network of academics that teach, research, and engage with the community, and basically bring this idea of business as a force for good. This is our global board members, and I like to emphasize we are based obviously on the US in Washington. That's where we are headquarters, but we have board members from 10 countries and 4 continents are represented. We started more as a community of practice. 2016, that was the first meeting in Wharton School in Philadelphia. Then in 2017, we met in Toronto. That's the first time I attended because they gave me a travel fund. And I thought, like everyone, other associations, I was like, this is very well established and everything is organized. And I realized that it was truly a community of practice, right? Of these passionate researchers and teachers that wanted to explore the phenomena. So I really got involved with them. Back 2018 in New Orleans, 2019 they came home to Los Angeles. In very, very interesting, in 2019 here in Los Angeles, they gave us, B-Lab gave us the Collective Action Award. And we appreciate this because it was a recognition of what academics can do for the movement in terms of course, their teaching and their research and their engagement. So we received that award. COVID forced us to go online with our PDW in August last year. And this year in 2021, in January, we launched the membership. Now we have, again, thinking in earned income strategies as a good nonprofit. We are trying to raise some funds so we can create some capacity and hire someone that can put a few hours a week because we are run by volunteers, but we have a membership now. We had an event with Marquis in February. We actually are engaging now with different countries. So we have a B Academic Spanish launch in March. We are organizing a teaching PDW on June 16. The research, we're trying to figure out with the research PDW next year if we should do it close to AOM or people are going to be Zoom out. And then we are preparing end of the year event that cannot tell more, but hopefully it goes as planned. It could be a big one with very prominent people involved in that one. We have been supported by some institutions from the beginning. These are some of our founding members, founding supporters. And this year we have a new wave of sponsors, universities that are, again, supporting us. We have 3 areas of activity and engagement in our teaching. We develop curriculum and materials, course design. We do a lot of work about that B Corp impact clinics, and we also produce teaching cases, research, and that's my colleague Joel, and community engagement through the B Locals. And as I said, we are also developing a model for global engagement with other academics in other countries. We, if I'm allowed, I'm in 57 minutes, maybe a little bit shorter. We have a call for engagement because we are going to be having elections soon. So we are creating different committees, and we are actually looking for at least 1 chair for our event committee. But there is room for everyone that could be interested in joining us at different capacity. We were surprised when we launched the membership. We have obviously academics, practitioners, but there's been a big welcome from students. Somehow they're finding a lot of value in PhDs and some master students. So we also want to have a student representative on the board. And that's one of the positions that is also open. We do have a newsletter. We don't send a lot of information and it's very good. So don't hesitate to sign up. And other than that, I'm hoping I can get some questions, and I want to thank you and give you my information so we can, stay in touch.
Thank you, Maria.
Thank you.
I was trying to see, there is there's one question that comes to mind, just getting back to the social innovation sandbox, if you will, metaphor, or some other metaphor is, is trying to kind of see where you imagine B Corp situating within a process of social change. So when I think about social innovation, and we have our kind of working definition on the center's website, I think of it having kind of three features. One is that they're going to be inclusive processes, they're iterative processes, and they're trying to address some systemic issue, a grand challenge, something that society has been struggling with one way or another. And I was curious if you've seen trends in B Corps as it relates to those dimensions of social innovation. Are they tending to address more systemic issues these days versus before? Are they, kind of engaging in more inclusive practices with respect to either customers or, kind of supply chains? So I'll just leave it at that because I wanted you to kind of feel free to answer, any direction that makes sense.
Yeah, it's really a coincidence that you are asking me that, because this morning at 8 a.m. we met with B Lab, because B Lab, US and Canada are actually trying to really work on the theory of change. And it goes back to the comment I did before, is that many of the regional partners are really building, the awareness and just trying to get some momentum and some critical mass. But of course, B Lab Canada and US, they have the time to start reflecting. This is the only challenge that I see, because they're, again, this is on the making right now, and they have this ambitious draft that by 2025, they've been able to collectively scale this transformational business practice that actually creates systemic change, right? And they talk a lot about climate justice, racial equity, and stakeholder governance as the three main areas of activity. This is a challenge that I see. If you think of the impact assessment, you are measuring the organization performance, right? So we are here at the organizational level. And when you think about theory of change, I tend to think of more, an institutional level or macro level. So again, this is a question I'm struggling to see, is like, well, you have all these organizations that are creating some positive change that it get reflected in that score. How do we go for that organizational level performance in the arena to actually say, okay, we are creating systemic change? And I don't have the answer. And I think that's also what B Lab is trying to say, is like, can we say that if in the US we might have, 2,000 B Corps, they are doing all this good work, is actually changing or creating that systemic change, right, through the business practice, and specific in those areas, climate justice, racial equity, and stakeholder governance. And for me, one of the key pieces there is the actual legal status that might help with that, to connect those two levels, because there is a gap there.
No, thank you for that answer. The other thing that occurs to me, I'm not sure if it's, kind of, again, not having researched B Corps like yourself, is if there's been trends in how B Corps try to connect beyond just their customers or their funders, but connect to others who are working in issues of racial justice, for instance. Are they starting to link to these broader networks, or is it simply all one can do is just to kind of simply, as an organization, be as effective as you can, and you just don't have the bandwidth to reach out more broadly?
A couple of thoughts. One is about resources, for sure. That is a challenge. And when this morning they were explaining to us, what they would like the B Corps to start doing, that was one of my questions. Are you asking them on the top of taking the impact assessment and have this roadmap to do better in the certification, in 3 years? What specific actions are you asking them to take to change, again, behavior and culture? Because they are strapped for resources. I don't think I'm saying anything new, but I don't want you to think about the B Corps and again, we're going back to this heroical individual in the social entrepreneurship arena. They are already working in community, not only between other B Corps, but many of them are engaging in another collective groups, beyond the B Corp movement. And in fact, when you look into the impact assessment, you get more points if you have, that kind of engagement. Who is your provider? If you are working as a bank, for instance, if you're working or banking with a B Corp bank, if you're in your business model, actually you are selling a product to population at risk. What engagement you have with nonprofits. I mean, that's where it gets recognized through the impact assessment.
Great. Well, I don't want to ask all the questions. We have time for maybe one or two more within the group.
And yes, please, if people can join us on that teaching workshop, it's going to be, of course, on Zoom, but we're thinking about 3 hours right now. We're closing the agenda as we speak, but it will be published on the website pretty soon. Our members get into all the events for free as long as we are in Zoom. That's part of the perks of membership. But we are keeping, like $30-40, and we have different prices for students and, of course, for the Global South. It's a little bit cheaper. So thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you, Maria. We look forward to continuing to engage with you on this as you learn more.
Absolutely.